Io sono David Ellwood e è un grande onore di poter concludere questa scuola che deve essere stata un'esperienza molto interessante, coinvolgente, emozionante, stimolante, brillante, eccetera, eccetera. Mi dispiace che non ho potuto partecipare tutti questi giorni, anche se conoscendo questo ambiente, se avessi saputo di questo ambiente, sarei senz'altro venuto anche una settimana prima. Allora, la mia conversazione, che è in inglese, spero che non vi dà troppi problemi, è intitolata Economics Makes the World Safe for Democracy. Economics Makes the World Safe for Democracy. Quindi parto dalla famosa affermazione di Wilson, quando ha annunciato la partecipazione americana alla Prima Guerra Mondiale, ovviamente. Oh, sorry. No, una volta perdo la differenza. Economics Makes the World Safe for Democracy. The subtitle is Prosperity and Freedom in the American View. Quindi una grande volata in alto, non in alto in termini intellettuali, ma in termini di altitudine sopra la materia. Prima è diviso in 4-5 parti. C'è un'introduzione. Prima l'introduzione, quindi. The Americans have always been, in the great majority, a people of plenty, of material well-being, of opulence, of affluence, of a generalized prosperity. De Tocqueville said it in a couple of famous chapters. David Potter, the social historian, said it in a famous book of 1954. People like Benjamin Friedman have been saying it recently in books like this one, The Moral Consequences of Economic Growth of 2005. Moral Consequences of Economic Growth, 2005. America's philosophers have thought long and hard about where America's riches came from, starting, of course, from the abundance of the land that God endowed them with. They talked of their particular kind of Protestant religion, which favored the individual work, merit in a spirit of free community. This book describes this tradition at length. Not a word, it must be said, about any Catholic contribution to this idea. They evolved their own brand of capitalism, obviously, which promoted risk, innovation, competition, bigness, and exalted the entrepreneur with his capacity for creative destruction, a famous phrase of Schumpeter. Some, like Frederick Jackson Turner, who Professor Bonazzi knows so well, even thought that the frontier experience had endowed the national mentality with special gifts of toughness, self-reliance, inventiveness, exuberance, and so on and so forth. By the end of the 19th century, as you've already heard in these days, they were facing the almighty consequences and contradictions thrown up by the workings of these impulses in a land of weak government, with no organized banking system, with so few social or legal mechanisms for handling the tremendous forces of urbanization, monopoly, mass production, exploitation, which rose up in those years. Yet in the face of all these contradictions, Americans remained convinced to the last man that the future belonged to them. After the Spanish-American War of 1898, a senator called Chauncey Depew, could only an American with a name like that, said, "There is not a man here who does not feel 400% bigger in 1900 than he did in 1896. Bigger intellectually, bigger hopefully, bigger patriotically, bigger in the breast from the fact that he is a citizen of a country that has become a world power for peace, for civilization, and for the expansion of its industries and the products of its labor." That's 1900. What I want to show in this talk is not simply how America became a great power with its civilization and its markets and its industries, but how, after the Great War and the beginning of the age of ideology and totalitarianism, the presumed lessons of America's experience of progress and prosperity were transformed into a ceaseless effort, which still goes on, to save the world, and Europe in particular, from itself, from backwardness, Ignorance, class conflicts, feudalism, militarisms, and all the other malignancies which Americans had long identified in Europe and which had produced now the Great War and then dragged America into it. Then, as the dictatorships flourished in the 1920s and 30s, and a Second World War rose up, the threat of a Second World War arose. These diagnoses, these American diagnoses I want to show, became ever more intense, urgent, and convinced. And they were turned by a huge intellectual effort within and without government during the Second World War into specific designs for remaking the world after the war itself. This great push, this intellectual push, found its highest expression, I believe, in the Marshall Plan, which in its turn was the starting point for the great parabola in favor of world development, which has outlasted the Cold War and in spite of all its disappointments can still be seen in the language of George W. Bush and Barack Obama and many other commentators right down to last Monday, as I will show. When we see calls coming today for a new Marshall Plan here and there across the world, even in Europe itself, Charlie Mayer a few weeks ago, then we know that this profound American faith, in the connection between prosperity and freedom, or if you like, capitalist growth and democratic stability, this faith is still with us, alive and inspirational. So that's the introduction, okay? Wilson. Let's start, as usual, with Woodrow Wilson. Here's Woodrow Wilson talking to Congress in his address announcing the armistice of 1918. So right at the end of the war, okay? This is Wilson speaking. Wilson says, "Hunger does not breed reform. It breeds madness and all the ugly distempers that make an ordered life impossible. Unhappy Russia has furnished abundant recent proof of that." End of quotation. So, for Wilson, the moral of the story was clear. The Russian Revolution. Moral of the Russian Revolution was clear. Quote, "Nations that have learned the discipline of freedom should now rule the world by the sheer power of example and of friendly helpfulness." The sheer power of example and friendly helpfulness. End of quote. Wilson, of course, was not an economist, and he attracted the disdain of Keynes at Versailles during the Versailles Conference, because Wilson, like all the others, neglected all the material realities, the unpleasant material realities, which in Keynes's view were the key elements in restarting the life of the war-torn continent after World War I. But there was one man at the Peace Conference who struck Keynes quite differently. This was Herbert Hoover. Herbert Hoover, at the time, had been a mining engineer with experience across the world. After 1918, his specific contribution was to invent another new means for projecting American power into Europe: large-scale humanitarian relief organizations. On the basis of prolonged experience in attempting to bring relief to the Russian people, Hoover had become a militant anti-communist. He explained in his memoirs, which are very much worth reading, very well written, the communists, the Russian communists, he said, found so receptive an audience in hungry people that communist revolutions at one time seized a dozen large cities and one whole country. This is right after World War I, okay? And one whole country, Hungary. We, in other words, me and my relief empire, sought diligently to sustain the feeble plants of parliamentary government which had sprung up in all of those countries. A weak government possessed of the weapon of food and supplies for starving people can preserve and strengthen itself more effectively than by arms. A weak government which has at its disposal food and supplies for starving people can survive in a way it cannot do by the force of arms. Hoover, who shared with Wilson this view of these realities, said, "A foundation of real social grievance fed the revolutionary movement in Russia. In other words, it wasn't just about ideology or the work of a small revolutionary conspiracy. He said, Hoover, the Bolsheviks were able to gain leverage from, quote, the not unnatural violence of masses who had learned the grief of tyranny and violence over generations. Our people, says Hoover, talking to Wilson, who enjoy so great liberty and general comfort, cannot fail to sympathize to some degree with these blind gropings for better social conditions. So this is not in no interest at all in Lenin or Bolshevism, whatever these people are saying. This is blind gropings for better social conditions. Moving on, 1930s. Franklin Roosevelt and his Secretary of State, Cordell Hull, they too shared this sort of economistica idea of where totalitarianism and revolution was coming from. They took seriously the arguments that Nazis and fascists liked to make about the grievances which the have-not nations felt towards the have nations, the rich nations against the poor nations. And they casted their perceptions of Japanese imperialism, I think, back onto Europe, taking for granted that what Nazis, fascists, communists all wanted really was a fair share of world trade and access to raw materials, a fair share of world trade and access to the means of prosperity. But that still left to be explained how tiny extremist groups, such as the fascists and the Nazis, and the Bolsheviks, if you like, as well, could become mass movements and take over great nations. Here again, it was Cordell Hull. It was Cordell Hull spelled out the rationale which would sink deepest into the American official mind in the succeeding years. I believe that by the time ideological and psychological dimensions had been added to it, this view of Hull's, it would go on to become one of the key orthodoxies of the Cold War and beyond. Here is Hull talking to the British ambassador in early 1936, before the Spanish Civil War had broken out. It is in the memoirs. The most incomprehensible circumstance, said Hull, in the whole modern world is the dominating ability of individuals or one man to arouse the mental processes of the entire population of a country, as in Germany and Italy, to the point where overnight they insist upon being sent into the frontline trenches without delay. When, and this is the key phrase, when people are employed and they and their families are reasonably comfortable and hence contented, they have no disposition to follow agitators and to enthrone dictators. Okay? So the problem is not where does Stalin come from, where does Hitler come from, where does Mussolini come from. The point is, how do these maniacs get a mass following? And the answer, of course, in this analysis is because of desperation, economic desperation. And of course, the way Hitler came to power, when mass unemployment in Germany was 44%, was an absolute confirmation of this view of the world. An interesting story concerning Hull and the Italian invasion, fascist invasion of Ethiopia. Hull had asked the Italian ambassador after the invasion why Mussolini had not invested $100 million in the country instead of invading it. Now, he told the British diplomat in his previous conversation that if only Italy had been able to keep up her pre-crisis export trade, there would probably be no military campaign. As for the future, if only a $20 billion increase in international trade could be brought about, an investment to provide work for 12 to 14 million people, then this might make the whole difference between peace and war in Europe. Still, this is before World War II. In his memoirs, which are published in the year the Marshall Plan starts, 1948, Hull expanded on these themes. He said, "A people driven to desperation by unemployment, want and misery is a constant threat of disorder and chaos, internal and external. It falls an easy prey to dictators and desperados. Insofar as we make it easy for ourselves and everyone else to live, we diminish the pressure on any country to seek economic progress through war. The basic approach to the problem of peace is the ordering of the world's economic life so that the masses of the people can work and live in reasonable comfort." Okay? That is the basic lesson. Now this, I believe, this is the starting point for a series of elaborazioni along these lines, which involved the American intellectual class, journalists, political scientists, government people, think tank people from this time onwards. And it becomes more sophisticated. I believe this line of thinking, which sounds so economic and so deterministico, becomes more sophisticated as it moves on, especially as it looks at the causes, the presumed causes of the Second World War. Why is there now a Second World War starting again in Europe, started by a political maniac who somehow has been able to take over a great country and totally transform it? Here is what I believe is one of the key commentaries along these lines. It comes from an international journalist and commentator called Vera Dean. She's one of these small group of people like Walter Lippmann, Dorothy Park, Anne McCormick, who provide very sophisticated commentary on international relations in the newspapers of this time. Here she's writing in 1939, before the war starts. She says, what Nazism and communism share was a revolt of the dispossessed classes against industrial capitalism and such remnants of feudalism as the aristocracy, the officer class, and a politically minded church. Both, Nazism and communism, sought to provide the masses with material opportunities and a taste of power hitherto reserved for a social elite. Both, paradoxical as it may seem, and this is a Cree sentence, represented an effort to realize the promises held out by the political democracy of the 19th century, which the possessing classes had too often failed to translate into terms of economic democracy in an age of mass production. I think this is a very brilliant perception. What she's saying is, in Europe, the political classes had conceded political democracy, suffrage, elections, parties, expanded access to parliament. What they had not done was concede economic democracy, which in an age of mass production, industrial revolution, produced a giant contradiction. I believe that this was the key American, if you look at all this American debate, which is enormous and very intense, and goes on all the way through the Second World War. I believe that this is the key American perception and understanding of the roots of world wars, of Great Depression, of totalitarianism. This is one of the reasons why totalitarianism is one concept which seems to us to bundle together in a very crude way lots of different things, why it stands on its feet in America. And it fed the determination of that nation's government to place the peace of the world on a different non-European footing, foundations, after the Second World War. Okay, moving on. I go into this debate, this World War II debate. I say it's a very philosophical war. Again, this is, I mean, in Europe, this is not so well known at all. In a country like mine, Britain, it's not completely ignored. Intellectual history. Let's start a little with an intellectual historian, a man called Olivier Zuntz, who comes at the bottom of every bibliography with a name like that, Zuntz. His book, Why the American Century, ? Points out that by the time of it became obvious that we were in another world war, American businessmen, researchers, university leaders, foundation trustees, and government officials had quietly constructed a vast institutional matrix of inquiry, a system whose purpose was to turn knowledge of the universe into all its forms into concrete economic, social, and scientific projects which could potentially challenge existing arrangements in any part of the world. I've just been told of another book in which another researcher has demonstrated how nearly 1,000 universities mobilized when war broke out to offer intellectual resources to the government, 1,000 in America. One of the most famous products of this mobilization, intellectual mobilization, was, of course, the American Century article published by Henry Luce, the man who created Time magazine, Life magazine, and Fortune, published in 1941. Luce said that when the American people finally faced up to the challenges of their time, they would see that these were to make their nation, quote, the dynamic leader of world trade, a land which will, quote, send throughout the world its technical and artistic skills, one which would feed hungry people everywhere with boundless produce. Feed hungry people everywhere with boundless produce. Remember, he's a Republican, he's not a Democrat, he's not a Roosevelt man. Anyway, by the beginning of 1942, that was one example, by the beginning of 1942, every leading speaker in the great debate on America's position in the world after the war had been obliged to promise at least a new world organization to construct the peace, a transformed global trade system, and a democracy based on rising purchasing power. Every leading speaker, including these people I mentioned before, Wendell Willkie, Henry Wallace, church leaders, businessmen, people, and so forth. The government itself had made very clear just how serious its intentions were along these lines. 4 freedoms, the Atlantic Charter, the Lend-Lease Act. The Lend-Lease Act. Let's not forget Lend-Lease, a very complex proposition, an extraordinary proposition, which includes in Article 7 this key clause insisting that after the war, there will be a world trade system, a liberalized world trade system. And if you want Lend-Lease supplies, you've got to sign up. You've got to promise that you will participate in constructing it, which immediately means the end of colonial empires. And the British understood it right away. Seems absolutely legalistic technical language, has explosive implications. So these are the key principles which the Americans identify for the world after the war, even before they're in the war itself. The 3 key principles: revised collective security system, multilateral trade liberalization, and raising living standards everywhere. 2 of them are strictly economic. Strictly economic. And in my book, I try to demonstrate how liberalized trade is actually the most important of all of them. So, in this way, the unsettled, uncertain United States in the 1930s, which nobody took seriously in foreign policy terms, half international system, half out of it, had suddenly turned into a revolutionary, even evangelical nation. Much of this intellectual effort, which went on throughout the war, inside America, was dedicated to exploring just how the perceived American experience of the connection between economic progress and democratic liberty might be translated into empirical, universally applicable recipes, formulas, programs. The favorite model of all was probably the Tennessee Valley Authority, the TVA, the great New Deal system of dams, hydroelectric plants, and irrigation projects, which had transformed the prospects of a once backward rural region, Tennessee. Among the people who pushed the TVA as a formula for transforming Europe were people like Sumner Welles. Harry Hopkins did the same. Sumner Welles pointed out that the Danube and the Balkans could be transformed if something like the TVA could be applied in that region. Or in all these debates in government, in the think tank, Council on Foreign Relations, universities, the press, and so on, the language is always the same. Interdependence, trade liberalization, end of European colonial empires, come fosse niente, raising living standards everywhere. The moral responsibility of the leading power, the United States then, was by the power of example, using the Wilsonian language, to teach these lessons to America's allies, the ones who'd signed up to all these things, like the Atlantic Charter, Lend-Lease, and so on, and link these lessons to their self-interest, to insist on the need to think in the long term, to demonstrate the supremacy of just that factor whose exclusion had ruined Versailles. In other words, economics. Economics. Economics as planning, economics as business, economics as growth. Growth. Growth is a World War II concept. Growth is an American concept. Growth is expressed officially for the first time in the language we understand now at the Bretton Woods Conference. You can actually see it being used there for the first time in official language. Bretton Woods is a place where the language of growth makes its debut on the world stage. What it meant right away was the language of deflation, the 1930s language, discourse, narratives of deflation, austerity, protectionism, and shrinkage, so common to the 1930s, and which have come back to us in these days. All this will be totally swept away. Over the long run, the idea of growth implied that the state would take on a quite new degree of control and power over economic processes. A kind of control which would deliver specific economic benefits to the mass of its citizens as quickly as visibly as possible, thereby guaranteeing the state's own credibility and renewing the legitimacy of democratic capitalism at a time when, in Europe at least, it had never been so low. The shift from the language of prosperity to that of growth is crucial, I think, because of the role of the state and the lessons of World War II Keynesianism in Washington. This book fails on this level. It doesn't talk about the difference between prosperity and growth. The best definition of growth I ever came across was from the strategic studies man in Washington, Eddie Luttwak, who talked about the ever-expanding prosperity for an ever-expanding majority. An ever-expanding prosperity for an ever-expanding majority. And that, too, that very language implies a degree of control of over economic processes which you never see before World War II. Moving on. The finest expression, the highest expression of this vision of the world, of this growth-oriented vision of the world, and also of the need to teach Europeans how to understand what it's all about, is, I believe, the Marshall Plan. A Marshall Plan meant many things to many people. There was no plan at the beginning. There was a basic idea and a basic impulse, and it grew and improvised along the lines of a central theme. But one of the ways which it linked, the Marshall Plan was linked to all these World War II debates and innovations, was through the creation of new institutions to promote economic control and development in the world, and in Europe in particular. During the World War II, we'd seen International Labour Organization reborn, Food and Agriculture Organization reborn, World Bank and International Monetary Fund created ex novo, International Trade Organization proposed, never actually came into being. What we had was GATT, that's another story. And of course the economic dimensions of the UN Charter. When these turned out to be totally inadequate for the real situation prevailing in Europe at the end of the war, there was another institution was created, the European Cooperation Agency, which was the outfit which actually ran the Marshall Plan. And that too created two new institutions, the OEEC, which is the OECD now, and the European Payments Union, which is a kind of virtual central bank, the bridge between the Marshall Plan and the Treaty of Rome of 1957. The Marshall Plan was in fact a press innovation. That phrase was invented by the press, not by the government. The Marshall Plan was a popular umbrella term for all this. And nowhere more clearly than there can you see the force of American convictions linking economic growth to democratic stability, especially because the Marshall Plan has made a point of teaching the Europeans through a vast array of information and propaganda just how this link worked and how it could be emulated, how it could be copied by those willing to work for an American standard of living, those who seriously wanted an American standard of living. The implied message of the Marshall Plan, as I've said in many places, was you too can be like us. Or as Obama would say, yes, you can, or would have said once upon a time, yes, you can. But that's conditional. It's conditional. It's yes, you can. It's a promise. It's a promissory note. Because this only works if you follow our two great policy prescriptions linking prosperity to freedom. And those two policy prescriptions are productivity and integration. These are the two specific programs which turn the American myths into American model. People at the head of the Marshall Plan went out of their way to teach Europeans these lessons. There was a specific program to teach them a difference, for instance, between capital, the European way, and capitalism, the American way. Here was a key technocrat, Marshall Plan technocrat, Richard Bissell, talking about what this meant, the other implications of these lessons. American machinery, American labor relations, and American management and engineering are everywhere respected. What is needed is a peaceful revolution which we can incorporate into the European economic system certain established and attractive features of our own, ranging from productivity and integration to high volumes of production to collective bargaining. This, he says, will require a profound shifts in social attitudes in Europe, attuning them to the mid-20th century. Here's the head of the Marshall Plan in Italy, Mike Dayton, being ever more explicit about what's at stake, talking to a group of industrialists in Geneva in 1950. What would happen to them if they didn't embrace these American programs and formulas? Gentlemen, he says, is there anyone here who believes that half measures, half cooperation, and timid support of a plan to vitalize democracy can win anything except the privilege of hanging from the arcade of a filling station should we lose? There's really dramatic stuff. He's saying, you know, what happened to Mussolini can happen to you again if you don't renew democracy, renew your faith in democracy our way. Remember, at the time, Italy is a place where the Communist Party was thought to be able to come to power by economic means, where the Marshall Plan propaganda effort was greater than in any other of the 16 countries. The teaching effort of this crucial epoch was not just limited to the Marshall Plan. There's the Truman Doctrine. The Truman Doctrine, which said, among other things, the seeds of totalitarian regimes are nurtured by misery and want. They spread and grow in the evil soil of poverty and strife. They reach their full growth when the hope of a people for a better life has died. We must keep that hope alive. Well, the Truman Doctrine is meant to promote aid to Greece and Turkey, and there are some very interesting reflections on Greece provided by a famous American historian who first went there on a military mission to Athens in 1945. We're talking about W.H. McNeill, great Chicago historian who went to Greece repeatedly in the succeeding decades. He said right after 1945, if economic conditions could be so improved that every Greek was able to live as well as he had been brought up to expect, which is another story, it seems probable that the excessive concern and fanaticism which the people now manifest for political parties and programs would diminish. Prosperity then enables a democratic debate to take place. And there's more along those lines. I'll just cut them out. Then there's Truman's Point 4, 1949. Truman's Point 4, his inaugural address when he's confirmed president, in which he talks about bringing the benefits of America's technological progress to the backward masses of the world, going universal, opening the way to all those efforts to stage growth everywhere it was thought to be lacking by the standards now defined in Washington. We're talking about all the development programs of the 1950s and 60s. These vast projects have now been thoroughly discredited and deconstructed, not just by reality, by American historians such as Michael Latham, Niels Gilman, and others. But as historians pick through the wreckage of all these theorems and strategies about development, one thing becomes clear down to this day. Americans continue to stick to their faith in the upholding, pacifying, stabilizing, moralizing effects on individuals and their societies of economic growth. Benjamin Friedman, in introducing his long study of this faith, says this: economic growth, more often than not, fosters greater opportunity, tolerance to diversity, social mobility, commitment to fairness, and dedication to democracy. Ever since the Enlightenment, Western thinking has regarded each of these tendencies positively and in explicitly moral terms. But it's America, he doesn't say this, what I'm saying, what he implies is it's America which, through its idea of prosperity, has transformed these moral standards into something available and accessible to everybody. I conclude by looking at Obama and Bush and Obama. And I won't go into the details here, But I say, if you look at the National Security Strategy of 2002, look at Obama's Nobel speech of 2006, you can see variations on the same theme: economic development as the key to democratic stability. Bush obviously thinks much more in terms of trade, markets, and competition. Obama thinks much more in terms of tackling climate change, of guaranteeing social security, guaranteeing an idea of fairness. But the key, what links them, is the idea that development and growth were the key to all this. So winding up, all of this is very familiar to us today. We're all submerged now in the great impulse for a return to dynamic economic growth as soon as possible, with warnings about the risks of political extremism and protectionism coming back if we don't face up to this necessity. But seen from the point of view of European political ideas and their evolution, all this American emphasis on the economic premises of democracy looks quite peculiar. Seen from the point of view of European political ideas and their evolution, all this American emphasis on economic premises of democracy looks pretty peculiar. My favorite reading in this area recently has been Jan Werner Muller's book, Contesting Democracy: Political Ideas in 20th Century Europe. A German political historian of political ideas, now working in Princeton. That book is not a philosophical tract as such, a history of ideas, as much as a study of the link between ideas and the creation or destruction of political institutions and policies. My point here is very simple. In this book, economics is nowhere. He goes all the way through from the beginning of the 20th century, all the way through to the 1960s, 68 movements, feminism, environmentalism, everywhere. Economics is nowhere. He talks about hegemony, of course. He talks about legitimacy. He talks about credibility. He talks about leaders, policies, institutions. Yet prosperity and growth are nowhere. The values associated with the democracy, positive and negative, are often cited. The economic basis of their functioning, what happens when capitalist economies betray the liberal notions they propounded, well, they're just not mentioned. There is, of course, Max Weber. There's always Max Weber. He said in 1919, of course, that there were three bases of legitimating rule: tradition, formal legal procedures, and personal charisma. He also said, according to Muller, that the state should be preoccupied not so much with the well-being of people in the future as with the quality of future people's character. Contrast this with what Walter Lippmann said in 1934. Walter Lippmann, the great commentator, political commentator. This is 1934. The modern state cannot endure unless it ensures to its people their standard of life. Only by making its people economically secure can a modern government have independence, wield influence in the world, preserve law, order, and liberty. And he says at a certain point, the price of toleration of the masses, of the working of capitalism, is the delivery of a decent standard of living. In 1896, he said it was the full dinner pail. In other words, food for everybody. By 1928, the price had risen. It had become the two-car garage. Imagine trying to speak that language to Max Weber. Victoria de Grazia has shown us how the American concept of the standard of living, a cultural idea defined in terms of the democracy of consumption, did spread in places throughout Europe between the wars. It's legitimate to imagine how, together with a force like Hollywood's, which David Potter pointed to so specifically, these influences did contribute to the revolution of rising expectations which Marshall planners identified as having going on throughout the world before, during, and after the Second World War. In fact, even further back probably, from the time when political democracy first looked the Industrial Revolution in the face, when political democracy faced up to the implications of the Industrial Revolution. But as Vera Dean's judgment and much of their other evidence makes clear, The lessons that American history was assumed to teach about the connections between economic progress under capitalism and democratic stability, these lessons were not so easily absorbed in Europe. Many Americans would say they never have been, and so they continue to preach to us about labor markets and productivity, about competitiveness and entrepreneurship, and about innovation and risk and trust. Look at the Repubblica last Monday, reproducing an article from the Washington Post about how backward Italy is because it's not up to date when it comes to competitiveness, risk, innovation, entrepreneurship, blah, 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 all the rest. This is last Monday. Same language. You're going to find exactly the same sort of discourse 20 years ago, 40 years ago, and so on. The Europeans, in reality, have sought a kind of synthesis between their preferred traditions, however identified, and the sort of modernity preached by America. And that research is the heart of my new book. In other words, a French way to modernity, a British way, a Polish way, even a European way to be modern. This effort of theirs is now in crisis. At least the Americans still have a faith to preach. The Europeans just try, each in their own way, to be as European as possible in the circumstances. Thank you.